So if you were listening to hard rock or heavy metal back in the 1980s, or if you're interested in that kind of stuff, I mean, people like Def Leppard and Queensryche and AC/DC and even Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin, who we were listening to back in the 80s, even though they came from a previous era, you're going to, I think, really, really enjoy this video today. What I found is this really interesting newspaper article called Heavy Metal Bands Back Carry Much Weight with Kids. And this was printed in 1983. Now, I've only glanced through this thing, so we're going to read this thing together. But it basically analyzes this heavy metal trend that was happening back in the early 1980s. And it goes through some of the famous people at the time and what is this all about? And again, if you lived during that era like I did and loved this stuff, I think you're going to get a kick out of this article. There's some really kind of fun stuff in here. And so this was from the Plain Dealer, December 16th, 1983, page 143. And it looks like this was printed in Cleveland, Ohio. Okay, and the title of the article is Heavy Metal Bands Back Carry Much Weight with the Kids. Okay, here we go. We're going to go through this and see what they have to say. Some rock music fans, writers, and musicians have lamented the loss of the wild, free spirit of early rock and roll with its irreverence, rebelliousness, and ability to widen the generation gap. Where are those bands that cause parents to gripe about the weird-looking people whose photos are on their kids' walls? They're right under your nose. They are the heavy metal bands. They wear black leather and spandex pants and loads of silver studs and chains and command the stages of arenas around the world with clouds of dry ice fog and ear bleed volume levels. Music business powers that be cringe to consider these groups the natural descendants of Elvis and the Beatles, but they are. They are the groups your parents don't like. Heavy metal is stated a record company bio on British heavy metal quintet Judas Priest, the stuff that sends hordes of 15-year-old boys into fist-raising, slavering, I can't remember how you pronounce that, ecstasy. Okay. That is absolutely fascinating and so true. And I remember this era, how the heavy metal bands, especially, it was just the things that parents love to hate. Now, I was actually really lucky in my life because I listened to that stuff and I had all the records and everything. And my parents were pretty cool about it because I had friends whose parents, when they were at school, would go through their records and go through their stuff and throw things away. And I never had that. You know, my parents they were kind of like, you know, he's doing good in school. Everything seems normal. Let's just leave him alone. And so they just kind of treated it that way. And so I listened to all the heavy metal music and all the stuff. And I think I turned out okay. You know, but what was better though, is that we didn't have strife. Because I knew so many kids that the stuff that, and it somehow all came back to this evil music that's turning you, and they just had these terrible relationships with their parents because it was over this, which seemed crazy to me, but that's what it was. And heavy metal, that music just brought it out for some reason. Okay. Heavy metal is generally conceded to have begun with Led Zeppelin with its debut album in late 1968 and defined by early 70s practitioners like Black Sabbath, Uriah Heep, and Deep Purple. That's an interesting way to put it. Began with Led Zeppelin, but defined by Black Sabbath. I don't know. I mean, I can kind of see it because a lot of people think, well, no, heavy metal started with Black Sabbath when Tony Iommi played those opening chords, those opening notes in the song Black Sabbath. Bam, bam, bam. You know, you remember that. A lot of people think, no, that is where heavy metal started, those notes. But anyway, it's interesting because a lot of people have called Led Zeppelin a heavy metal band. That term has gotten so, who knows anymore, right? But so again, it's an interesting way to put it. began with Led Zeppelin, defined by Black Sabbath, Uriah Heep, Deep Purple. Okay, heavy metal went into an eclipse in the mid-70s, but now it is back with a vengeance. Even the staid middle-of-the-road TV magazine program Entertainment Tonight did a piece recently on its return. And that's also interesting because I know a lot of people that watch this channel lived through that. I was too young. I didn't know what was going on in the 70s. I remember having some bell bottoms when I was 9 years old or something, but I wasn't really paying attention to music other than Kiss. I was one of the little kids that liked Kiss back in the 70s, but I didn't know anything about this. And so I wasn't paying attention to whether or not heavy metal or hard rock music was happening. Because of course, once the mid to late 70s hit, disco took over the world. Looking back, again, I wasn't super aware, but I kind of know what happened then. And all these bands that kind of took a back seat. And it did kind of seems like it came back in 80, 81 with the introduction of Iron Maiden, and then that whole idea, punk came in, and then Iron Maiden took some of that attitude and then kind of resurrected or brought back in the idea of heavy metal. So it never disappeared, but it definitely took a back seat. When, like they said here, went into an eclipse. Okay, in truth, it never left. While glitter and disco and punk and new wave enjoyed the limelight, heavy metal was clinging tenaciously to the underside of the music business, waiting to resume its place in the sun. During that period, heavy metal bands were forming and playing to diehard fans. Many groups that are part of the revival began playing their trade when metal wasn't cool. Groups like Judas Priest, AC/DC, Van Halen, Saxon, Crocus, and even the newly successful Quiet Riot. Its debut album, Metal Health, went to the number one spot on the record charts a few weeks back and bucked the punk new wave movement to play their music. This is actually really interesting because Quiet Riot, of course, they had the song called Metal Health, and they were considered a heavy metal band, although, I don't know. It was the song Come On, Feel the Noise, which was an old Slade song, really was, metal, I guess, in the sense that it had a distorted guitar and Kevin DuBro's voice was that screamy. And Metal Health did have that energy. The Slick Black Cadillac, that was off of the early Randy Rhoads Quiet Riot stuff anyway. But you go through this list here, Judas Priest, they were happening in the 70s, AC/DC, of course. They were Van Halen, they were Saxon, Crocus, and then again Quiet Riot. But what I was going to say is it is amazing how big Quiet Riot actually got. That first album, Metal Health, millions. We sold millions copies. I saw them on that tour, interestingly, opening up for the Scorpions. And I don't know, I liked that album in principle at the time, but then they just disappeared. Condition Critical came out after that, and I really didn't even follow much after that point. The early 80s brought a horde of bands: Def Leppard, Iron Maiden, Queensryche, Heaven, Rose Tattoo, Fastway, Wasted, and countless others. Some of the groups are young, some include veterans of the metal scene, but all seem to work a kind of magic on that fist-brandishing 15-year-old kid. Def Leppard. The album On Through the Night I didn't care much for, but the album High and Dry, one of the great hard rock albums of all time, and definitely, in my opinion, Def Leppard's best. And they were coming in at that time. Of course, Iron Maiden, mentioned them a second ago. They were those first two albums plus the Number of the Beast came in, and then Fastway, of course, that was Fast Eddie Clarke from Motorhead went and formed that band. Just a lot of, and Queensryche, of course, the EP that they put out with 4 songs, Lady Wore Black, Queen of the Reich, that EP was revolutionary in some ways. That I remember hearing that first Queensryche EP, and it wasn't produced really well. It was a little muddy, but still, there was something in there. And then, that launched them into becoming just humongous. They were giant by the late 80s, early 90s. Okay, Besides the similarities, heavy metal bands express identical attitudes about their craft. Recent interviews with AC/DC guitarist Malcolm Young, Quiet Riot vocalist Kevin DuBrow, and Black Sabbath guitarist Tony Iommi clarified the appeal of the music. Like almost every other heavy metal band in existence, these groups are totally involved in their music and with the audiences they play for. Many bands tinkered with their music to make it more commercial. Others followed new wave trends in order to be fashionable. You will find no heavy metal band among them. Malcolm Young's response to that possibility is, forget it. You've got the wrong band. We stick to our guns. And that's, AC/DC is one of those bands that really kind of did. You know, they've always been kind of a band of the people, just raw energy, rock and roll. They've never really, even in recent years, as they put out a song or two, they've never really lost that. I don't like them. I don't like the stuff that, honestly, to be honest, much of the stuff they put out after For Those About to Rock, which is one of the greatest rock songs of all time, but they kind of lost me a little bit after that. A couple of songs here and there, but okay, let's see here. And Kevin DuBrow, the garrulous and outspoken spokesman for Quiet Riot, that's an understatement, loudly condemned the trendy synthesizer rock. They sound awful. I hate it. They're disgusting. Quiet Riot's history shows the intense devotion that drives heavy metal groups. It formed in Los Angeles nearly 10 years ago, finding fans but no record contract. Its fans picketed the labels without success. It released a couple of albums in Japan only. It split up for a while. It lost a member in a plane crash during that hiatus. Yeah, it's not exactly what happened, but it wasn't. I mean, yeah, it was a hiatus, but he really wasn't a member anymore. They've got to be talking about Randy Rhoads. Randy Rhoads was gone. He was with Ozzy, and they were doing great. You know, Quiet Riot was over, and then they brought in Carlos Cavazo, and then resurrected it. And let's see here. Then it reformed, and in 1983 put out its first album. It didn't shoot to number one, buoyed by instant media and industry hype. These guys toured incessantly for 6 months, opening up to a half dozen different headliners. They did interviews, TV, radio, photo sessions. They worked the album to number one. Heavy metal groups don't have the advantage of the kind of hipness that surrounds new music. Artists like Big Country. All heavy metal bands did was, it's funny they picked Big Country as the example. I actually like Big Country. Matter of fact, I love the song Big Country. And they had another single, Look Away, which I thought was amazing. I actually really like those guys, but strange one to pick. Let's see. All heavy metal bands did was leap into the world, while new music bands were proving to be their own worst enemies, falling into the very traps of elitism and self-consciousness they claim to deplore. By the way, that was where heavy metal itself was headed less than 10 years after this article was written. Because that's when 1991, when Nirvana showed up on the doorstep and because heavy metal had done exactly the same thing. While Missing Persons, Blondie, and Men at Work insult their audiences, putting on them the burden of being entertained. That's really funny. Metal bands remember who paid for the tickets. $12 these kids pay, exclaimed Malcolm Young. Your show better be good for $12. I'd want to see the Beatles and Stones and The Who together on stage. That's so funny. For $12, I'd want to see the Beatles, the Stones, and The Who together on stage. That's really great. You might not like the music, but you can't help liking the group's attitudes. Respect for the kids is central to all these bands, DuBrow says of Quiet Riot's approach to performing. I would like for them to look on a Quiet Riot show as a party they went to and look back on and said, that was a great party. We have a spirit of camaraderie on stage, and we are not a faceless band in any way, shape, or form. I think there's more identification and involvement with us than with most bands. That's actually kind of an important thing. And it's something that Kiss figured out. And it was something that goes back to the Beatles. Because a lot of prog bands, as they got into, or bands like Pink Floyd and Yes and whatever, kind of became these, King Crimson kind of became these faceless bands where you didn't know who was in it or what was, you wouldn't have you couldn't have known anybody. If you ran into a member of the Moody Blues in the street, you would have never noticed who they were. But the Beatles, you knew each member and you had a favorite member. That just wasn't the case with a lot of those new bands that started hitting in the 70s. You didn't know. But Kiss recognized that. Said we need to, each one of us to have a personality. And then, and if you were a Kiss fan, you had a favorite member, just like you did with the Beatles. And a lot of these people kind of understood that when you started getting into the 80s. And you realized you had to have these personalities. And like it or not, AC/DC did the same thing. Angus Young created a persona, an alter ego that he would be on stage. And you just kind of liked it. And that kind of became a thing. And so it was similar with, even with Black Sabbath, you knew Ozzy, you knew Tony Iommi. I think, I like I said, I wasn't really aware at the time, but you knew who the members were. But they're noticing this point that there was a lot of those groups that kind of came in and that didn't have that lost that show, that appeal. Okay. Identification with both bands. Tony Iommi is the affable lead guitarist for Black Sabbath, the oldest living heavy metal band. And by 1983, by the way, they were well after the Ozzy period at that point. They were coming in on the Ian Gillan time here. I don't remember when Born Again came out. But of course, at this point, they had 2 Ronnie James Dio albums under their belt, plus Live Evil would have come out by now. Let's see here. It's never had Black Sabbath, the oldest living heavy metal band. It has never had a hit single, yet it is selling out large halls 13 years after releasing its first album. That, by the way, was a shock because they didn't expect it after Ozzy left, because they were washed up 4 years prior to this article being written. Let's see here. Iommi describes the interaction with the audience. Kids look at us and feel like they'd like to be up there doing that. I relate a lot to the audience. I like talking to kids. They sometimes look at you as an idol and feel they can't talk to you, but I don't mind. They enjoy the same things we enjoy. I get pleasure out of what we're playing, and kids get pleasure out of hearing it. He recalls a show in Stafford, England, where, quote, we saw rows of kids walking for miles to the show with badges and jackets. It's like an event to them. It's fabulous to see them walking around with millions of badges, flags, t-shirts. It's a great honor, really. Iommi, with so many years behind him, puts a realistic perspective on stardom that many rock musicians lack. Quote, the star trip is absolute rubbish. People may want to put you on a pedestal, but there's no reason to get big-headed. We see bands get that way, though. We just look and say, you'll see. And I tell you, if they're interviewing him in 1983, he has had really experience with this at that point, because they had dropped off dramatically in the late 70s. They were on top of the world in the early 70s, but they were falling apart and becoming nobodies. So he'd seen firsthand what it was like to go from the top to being confused and lost, and completely losing your way as a performer. Like Dubrow and Iommi, AC/DC's guitarist, songwriter Malcolm Young feels that, quote, kids get a release when they see us. They have a good time. It makes them happy. I don't think there is anything deep there. AC/DC emerged from Australia in 1976 to become one of the first of the current waves of metal bands to enjoy massive success, armed with sharper songs than most such groups. And I'll tell you something. They were one of those first groups. I don't know if I can say it that way. First groups. Yeah, I think that's maybe safe to say, that just really captured the testosterone energy of teenage boys, and that energy, like, just nobody really did it quite like they did. I mean, you look at those shots with Bon Scott and Angus Young. Go watch some of those early concerts, because there's a lot of that stuff online, and it is just teenage boys sweating and going crazy. They captured that thing, whatever that thing is, like nobody had before them. And you can tell why. I mean, there's Bon Scott, who's just kind of standing there like this tough guy, I mean, and he just really was just kind of a man of the people. And you as a teenage boy, I can imagine, because he'd just be up there with a pair of jeans, shirtless, hairy chest, got that microphone up and just had this, just all attitude. Bon Scott, he had a killer, cool, totally unique voice, but man, he just dripped with masculine testosterone attitude, like he was ready to go get in a fight, and he just captured that, whatever that thing is. And then with Angus Young, just the way he would run around that stage while Bon would they had that thing. So when Malcolm says kids get a release when they see us, yes, that's what they were. They have a good time. It makes them happy. I don't think there's anything deep there. And that is the truth. Okay. Let's see here. One of the most current wave of heavy metal bands enjoy massive success armed with sharper songs than most such groups. And that's probably true. AC/DC had so many great tunes. I don't know what he means for sure by sharper songs, but all their stuff was so gritty. And when Back in Black came out, and then For Those About to Rock, I don't know I think I mentioned that in this video. It wasn't another one, but just one of the greatest rock songs ever made. And just dripping again with that energy, whatever that thing is. Describing the band's stage show, Young reveals AC/DC's respect for the crowd's desires. If the new songs aren't going over as well as the old, we give them an old song. We find it takes a while for kids to get used to the new things. AC/DC avoids the "this is good and you better like it" approach of many bands which consider themselves AC/DC's artistic betters. Over and over, these groups express that commitment to the kids, whether they are virtually kids themselves like Queensryche. Yeah, okay, I see, because Queensryche, they were actually really young guys at this point. Whether they are virtually kids themselves like Queensryche or old enough to be the kids' fathers like Black Sabbath, probably not completely true, but yes, older. They feel as though they are part of the audience. They really like the music and they really like the kids. Is it any wonder the kids like them back? Says Malcolm Young, the best thing on stage is when you feel like you're part of the audience. Some nights you don't have that because of security or whatever. You have to try harder to break down that barrier and communicate. And that's the end of the article. Anyway, I thought you'd find that interesting. And, just for all of you that, like me, were enjoying this kind of music back in the 1980s and remembering what that period was like, what that attitude was like, what those bands were like, and as these things were changing, and as you go back to the beginning of this article, and these were the bands that parents hated. And I remember at this same period, and we'll make a whole other video about this sometime, but kind of putting a point on this, when Motley Crue came out, because they were part of this same period, they put out Too Fast for Love. That was their self-released album, which to me, I still think is maybe their best thing. I don't know. Shout at the Devil, I kind of like more, but it still was so great. When Shout at the Devil was going to be put out, you might remember that there was this group of people led by Tipper Gore, Al Gore's wife. I can't remember what they were called. But basically, they were trying to put warning labels on albums, that they would contain backwards messages or offensive lyrics or something like that. And I remember I was just kind of starting to pay attention back at this time when that was happening. And Nikki Sixx, I saw an interview with him a while ago where he said when they were going through the process of starting to do that, Nikki Sixx had this attitude like, seriously? You're going to do that for us? Kind of like you put a warning label on a hard rock record, and you're going to sell so many more. If you put a warning label, a warning for the parents, showing that this is a dangerous record that parents need to be aware of, Nikki Sixx is like, thank you. It's great. You're going to make me so much more money now. And so much so that on the back of the album Shout at the Devil, Motley Crue themselves, put their own warning label on the album. And I can't remember exactly what it says, but I think it's written in red on the back of the album. And it says, warning, this album may contain backwards messages. You remember back at the time, you play Stairway to Heaven backwards and it says blah, 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 which is just a bunch of BS, right? But they knew that scary stuff, especially the stuff that freaked the parents out, is what was going to move units, which was all they were trying to do was sell albums. And they knew how to do it. They knew that if they scared the parents, that if they got that is what would get the kids interested in it. And so many of these groups and the record companies knew it. And they capitalized on that whole idea. So when you go back to the beginning of this article and they're like, what happened to all these bands that were edgy and that the parents didn't like? Well, here they are. They're the heavy metal bands. And yep, exactly right. We're going to put music together. We're going to put album covers on these things. We're going to do everything we can to freak parents out because that's what's going to get the kids to love it. And it worked. We're great for a while. And then they had the backlash that we were talking about just a second ago that they address in here that happened with the bands in the early 80s. And that's why heavy metal came back. Well, same thing happened to heavy metal bands. You get into 1990 and 1991, and even I was getting like, this is getting a little bit silly. And then you had bands like Guns N' Roses. There was a little bit like a shot over the bow. They walked in with a little bit of a different attitude. And Metallica was really coming to life. And you could see that something was about to change because everything that had happened in the 80s had gotten tired. And it was just like, this is too crazy. It was like, who can play guitar faster and faster and faster and faster? Who can sing higher and higher and higher? Who can wear the most lipstick, the most hairspray? It just got out more and more, just more extreme. And no wonder when Nirvana hit, when that album came out and we heard that first chord of Smells Like Teen Spirit, all of a sudden you're like, whoa. The world collectively woke up and said, wow, we have really gotten out of control. And then it was like, back to basics. Anyway, I didn't mean to get off on that. This is so fascinating to me, reading this stuff that was happening right in those early days. And for those of you that experienced it, I hope you kind of enjoyed listening to that same thing. So, hey, please follow the channel, like this video. And if you lived during this era and you had favorite bands, you remember some of these bands or had other examples of this that aren't listed here, because there are a lot of them. I'd love to hear it. Leave it in the comments. Anyway, with that, have yourself a fantastic day.